Okay, Rabbi, you're
Okay,
on.
good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our adult ed session for this month. We're going to be talking about schisms in Judaism. And if you think about it, before we get started, one of the things that has created the depth and the texture and the multiple ways that you look at Judaism and the Jewish people is because of different schisms that have taken place down through the ages. I mean, if you want a very modern day example of schisms, look at the groups of Jews that exist today. For example, there are the Haredim, and then you have the Hasidim, and then you have the Orthodox, and you have modern Orthodox as an offshoot, and you have conservative Jews, and you have Reform Jews, and you have classical Reform Jews, and you have Reconstructionist Jews. All of those groups formulated because of some sort of schism that had taken place within the framework of Judaism and the Jewish people. So schism is not something that's unknown, nor has it actually been unwelcome necessarily in Judaism. And as I said at the beginning, one of the things that have sort of created the multiple layers of what Judaism is all about has been various or a variety of schisms that have taken place down through Jewish history. To begin with, I think it's important to start by talking about the Torah, but not only the Torah, but the difference between written and oral Torah, two very different kinds of Torah. And in order to really understand those, there are two groups of scholars or two groups of people that are really responsible for pushing each one of these different Torahs. The written Torah was pushed by a group of Jews called the Tanaim. They were scholars that lived around the 2nd century CE. The oral Torah was pushed by a group of Jews known as the Amoraim, come from the Hebrew word amar, to speak, and they pushed the idea of the oral Torah. Now, one of the basic premises on which the tradition of the Tanaim was based is the concept of these two Torahs, oral and written, which the rabbis actually believed were given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, according to the rabbinic view, and when I say rabbinic view, I'm not talking about modern day rabbis. I'm talking about scholarship down through the ages. So according to the rabbinic view, or according to Jewish scholarship down through the ages, the two Torahs were actually complementary. The oral Torah provided interpretations and explanations, which actually made possible the application of the written Torah as a way of life, as a way to live. So the two Torahs then were actually of equal status and authority with one another. Now, the accuracy of the transmission of the teachings of both Torahs were seen to depend not just on the correctness of the contents, but also on the mode of how it was transmitted. The Tanaim, the scholars from around the 2nd century, made clear that to be considered authentic, a tradition had to be transmitted in the same way that it was given at Sinai. So therefore, the written Torah had to be taught from a scroll, and the oral Torah had to be recited orally by one of these scholars. Now, the history of the oral law concept is rather complex. The earliest mention of this oral Torah is actually found in the history of Josephus. He asserts that the Pharisees, and we'll talk about the Pharisees in a little bit, because that's another schism that exists in Judaism. He asserts that the Pharisees possessed ancient traditions that they inherited from past generations. And these traditions, combined with ancient customary law, as well as emerging oral interpretation, which was developing by the Second Temple period, provided the basic content of what the rabbis later called oral law. At some point between the late 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, the notion began to be expressed that the oral law, along with the written, had been given at Sinai. And this development has been explained by some modern scholars as the result of a desire on the part of the rabbinic authorities to solidify their authority by claiming divine origin from their own traditions. Actually, these kinds of ideas were developing naturally as the various approaches to Judaism in the Second Temple period strove to provide the written law with an appropriate supplement to make it possible for the Torah to serve as a genuine way of life in the Greco-Roman period. In Pharisaic rabbinic Judaism, this was accomplished by the oral law. So in other words, in order for the Torah to be complete from the different groups that followed both oral and written tradition, you had to have both. They were sort of sockets that fit together at the end. And this idea allowed the Pharisees and later the later rabbis to develop kind of organically. It provided the basis for the assertion of continuity later on in Talmudic Judaism, an assertion that maintained even in the face of numerous adaptations and adjustments. For in the view of the rabbis, there were no changes. All later developments had already been commanded as part of the revelation that took place at Mount Sinai. In other words, everything that came after Mount Sinai, according to these rabbis, everything that followed from Mount Sinai was already spoken about to Moses at Mount Sinai. It already came to fruition orally to Moses at Mount Sinai. In other words, God had explained all of this to Moses at Mount Sinai, how this was going to adapt itself down through the ages, thus giving divine support to what we call Torah. If you think about the Talmud for a minute, Talmudic tradition always maintained that the notion that two Torahs were given on Sinai all the way back in time. Scholars have come to question that assumption. In any case, there is some evidence to show that the concept was fully developed in the aftermath of the revolt against those who sought to destroy the temple. By that time, appeals of the Sinai origin of laws were made, although the notion of a dual Torah and dual revelation was not nearly as evident as you might expect. Clearly, then, the idea was ongoingly developing in Pharisaic times, and unwritten laws of our ancestors, oral Torah, were an earlier stage of that development. So the question becomes, which came first? Was it the oral Torah or was it the written Torah? The concept became even more important in the period leading up to the destruction of the temple, in the difficult years after the revolt, when the support of the people at large was so important. The rabbis, in order to guarantee the authority of these teachings, occasionally appealed to the divine origin and the nature of oral law. It was only in Amoraic times, a century later, after the Tanaim, that the full midrashic basis of these ideas was worked out, with the rabbis asserting that the oral Torah and its authority were already mentioned in written law. So what you have here is a clear schism between those who felt that oral law was more important. In other words, the transmission of law orally to the community of Israel, rather than just being studied by the rabbis out of the scroll or out of the text. You might think about it for yourself. Which would you see as more important? Would it be oral law, the tradition that was orally given, the interpretation of it, or was it the actual text as it was written down in the Torah scroll itself? Remember, the actual, even though there's actual text and you have actual words on a scroll or in a scroll, it doesn't mean that those words cannot be interpreted in different ways by different people. So that's where oral tradition and written tradition merge, okay? Where you have actual words and those words become orally transmitted by the way that they're understood by the person who is reading it. So there's one schism in Judaism, the difference between oral and written Torah. Another schism that took place, and this one is a little more difficult to understand because we don't really think about this group of people. And the group of people that I'm talking about are the Samaritans. Now, at the time of, to give you a framework, at the time when Jesus was supposed to be on earth, the land of Samaria was situated between the regions of the Galilee in the north and Judea in the south. Jews who were traveling between the Galilee and Judea would take actually the longer 6-day journey that was along the Jordan River, rather than taking the shorter, more direct route through Samaria. And the reason that they took the longer route was that Jews wanted to avoid any kind of contact with the Samaritans because of the bitter history that ensued between Jews and Samaritans. Hundreds of years prior to that, after the death of King Solomon died in 975 BCE. The nation of Israel split into two, a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. We find this specifically written in scripture in the book of Kings in chapter 11 and chapter 12, if you want to reference for that split. The northern tribes of Israel were collectively called Israel, and the capital city of Israel was Samaria, again, from the book of Kings. The southern tribes were collectively called Judah. These were the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Simon. And their capital was not Samaria, of course, it was Jerusalem. A distance of about 50 kilometers separated the cities of Jerusalem and Samaria. All of the kings of Israel, pretty much without exception, were fairly unfaithful and disobedient to God in one way or another. They generally embraced idolatrous religions. They might have been considered what you might consider wicked or evil. And after many, many, many repeated warnings about impending disaster, unless Israel openly repented, the northern kingdom of Israel was overpowered by the Assyrians somewhere around 724 BCE. Many of the Israelites who survived the attack were physically lifted up and taken to foreign lands, where they were assimilated into native populations. Again, we find this in the book of Kings, the second book of Kings. These northern tribes are referred to, or you might know them as, the lost tribes of Israel. However, there were a few groups of Israelite families who retained their ancestral integrity. The Assyrians sent 5 eastern tribes to live in northern Israel. These 5 tribes brought with them their own foreign religions, along with their own foreign customs. The tribes were sent with the purpose of actually diminishing Israelite identity and Israelite culture. The Eastern foreigners intermarried with the remaining, much depleted Israelite population. And this hybrid group of people, they were the beginning of who we know to be called Samaritans. The Assyrian Empire fell to Egypt in 612 BCE. The Egyptians had already taken control of Samaria in 610 after taking the life of the Judean king, who at that time his name was Josiah, who had himself hoped to conquer Israel, the northern kingdom. The Egyptians were subsequently defeated by the Babylonians, and Samaria became a minor capital city of the Babylonian Empire from 605 to about 562 BCE. In 586 BCE, the southern kingdom of Judah was also conquered by the Babylonians. We find this not in Kings, but in the book of Chronicles. And the whole of Israel and Judah came to be known as Samaria. Now you may be, I'll just digress for a moment, you may have heard the term Samaria when you listen to the Haredim in Israel, because they refer to it in the old way. They don't refer to it as the northern kingdom or the southern kingdom. They call it Samaria, the same as the book of Chronicles calls it. Many Jews at that time were exiled from their homes. They were taken captive into Babylon for about 70 years. Now, all of this was prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah. You can read about this in the book of Jeremiah. You can also read about it in the book of Chronicles. The Jewish population was taken in a variety of different stages to Babylon. And it seems that only the poorest, the sickest, and the least skilled were ultimately left behind. These remaining people, those who were left behind, intermarried with their northern neighbors, with the result that foreign beliefs and customs mixed with Jewish beliefs and customs. The Jews who were taken to Babylon were treated fairly well while in Babylon. While some Jews lamented their captivity in a foreign land, if you look, you can find this specifically in the book of Psalms, others became established in their new communities. And when the Persian King Cyrus was divinely led to allow the Jews to return 70 years later, and again, we find this in the book of Ezra, only the most devout Jews returned to Jerusalem with the purpose of rebuilding the city and the temple that was destroyed by the Babylonians. The Babylonian exile was looked at as punishment for Judah's unfaithfulness to God. And the Jews had learned from that. The returned Jewish people were what you might consider zealous for God. They were zealous for righteous living. They never again engaged in any kind of blatant idolatry. The returning Jews were keen to rebuild the temple so that they could worship God in a way that God had prescribed to be worshiped. The Samaritans who were there offered to help the Jewish people in rebuilding the temple, but that offer was rejected. Again, we find this in the book of Ezra. The Jews of the post-exile period were also pretty zealous for Jewish scripture. Scribes copied them. Synagogues and schools were established to teach from them. And the real repentance over past idolatry, combined with this newly found fervor for scripture, resulted in an over-scrupulous interpretation of scripture and a fanatically detailed religious observance by various Jewish sects, like the Pharisees and those of the Qumran community. Now, the Qumran community, you may remember, or you may know, you may have heard of. This is the community that's known as the Dead Sea community. The Dead Sea Scrolls were from the Qumran community. In the meanwhile, the Samaritans actually had developed their own version of Judaism. The Samaritans still believed in the God of Israel, but they worshiped at Mount Gerizim instead of Jerusalem, with their own adapted religious and worship practices. The Samaritans had also their own Pentateuch, in other words, their own 5 books of Moses, not written in Hebrew, but written in Aramaic, which was the common language of the day, the spoken language of the day. It differed somewhat in places from the Hebrew Pentateuch. And to this day, the Samaritans, who still exist, do not accept the poetic or the prophetic books of Jewish scripture. In other words, they don't accept the books of the prophets, and they don't accept any of the books of the writings. Somewhere around 400 BCE, the Samaritans built a temple on Mount Gerizim. This event, this act, caused tremendous tension and hostility between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. The Jews who were living there at the time ultimately destroyed the Samaritan temple in 128 BCE. But the Samaritan religious community still continues to survive today. Most Jews, I won't say most Jews, many Jews, regarded the Samaritans as ignorant, as superstitious, and outside of God's favor and mercy. The Samaritans, however, were still very much part of God's plans. And moreover, you'll find if you were to go to Israel today, out on the West Bank, there is a very viable group of Samaritans. I was actually lucky enough when I was living in Israel to join the Samaritans for their Pesach, which was fascinating in terms of some of the differences and similarities between our Pesach and the Samaritan Pesach. But it was fascinating to see a group of people who are not considered Jews follow so closely along with Jewish customs and Jewish traditions. So that was another schism that took place within Judaism and the Jewish people. Another schism between Judaism and the Jewish people took place, and I'm gonna go through this one rather quickly because there's so much that I would like to cover today in the time that we have. I want to talk about the schism between Jews and what are known as Hebrew Christians. You might think of this as the Jewish Christian schism. That split between Judaism and Christianity did not come about simply, nor did it come about quickly. I mean, you could do an entire course on the roots of Christianity from Judaism and how the actual split took place over time. Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time today, but it is a course that I would like to teach at some point in the future, because I think it's fascinating to see how this split occurred and how Christianity, even today, in this century, the 21st century, still retains some of their Jewish roots where they came from. So it didn't happen quickly. It didn't happen simply. It was a fairly complex process that took place about 100 years, starting from the crucifixion of Jesus, and which had different causes and effects depending on whether you look at this from the point of view of Christianity or the point of view of Judaism. Also, another thing just to keep in the back of your mind before we get to the three different views of this schism, the Christian, the Jewish, and the Roman, was the question of the legal status as seen through Roman eyes, also had some relationship to do with this issue. From the standpoint of Christianity, the schism is not really difficult to trace. If you look at the earliest gospel texts, and again, when you're looking at Christianity, the one thing to keep in mind, I don't know how many of you have ever read the Gospels or spent any time looking at the Gospels in Christianity, but one of the things that you have to, at the very least, keep in the back of your mind is, what was the purpose of the Gospels? Were the Gospels written to further faith, or were the Gospels written to record history, or were the Gospels written as a combination of both? Different scholars come down in different ways as to why they think or what they think the purpose of the Gospels were. But if you look at some of the earlier gospel texts, which picture Jesus as debating issues of Jewish law with the Pharisees, at least in the Gospels, you don't find all that much hostility. The crucifixion is said to have been carried out by the Romans with the support of some apparently Hellenized Jewish priests. But as you trace the history of the New Testament tradition, they move from disputes with Pharisees, scribes, and chief priests, all members of the various Second Temple era Jewish sects, to polemics against the Jews and Judaism, from the notion of some Jews as enemies of Jesus to the demonization of the Jewish people as a whole. But by sometime in the 1st century, New Testament redactors had clearly decided that they were no longer part of the Jewish people. Therefore, they described Jesus as disputing with all of the Jews, not just some, as would be appropriate to an internal Jewish dispute. Once Christians saw Jews as the other, it was but a short stop to the notion that all Jews were responsible for the rejection of Jesus, and thus for the failure of Jesus's messianic mission to be fulfilled. So that's sort of, in short, the Christian view of the split between Judaism and Christianity. If you look at the Jewish view, I think that from the Jewish point of view, the matter is a lot more complex. By this time, Tannaitic Judaism, remember we talked about the Tanaim a little while ago, Tannaitic Judaism, that of the earlier rabbinic sages, they were characterized, remember, by the emergence of oral law, was already the dominant form of Judaism. The Pharisees had emerged from the revolt against Rome as the main influence within the Jewish community. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Pharisees and the Sadducees in a few moments. After the destruction of the temple in 70 CE by the Romans, the Tanaim immediately recognized the need to standardize and unify Judaism. Remember, there was no more temple cult, there was no more sacrifice, there was not going to be any more active priesthood. So the Tanaim saw the need to standardize and unify Judaism. And one of the first steps that they took to standardize and unify Judaism was to standardize what we know to be called the 18 benedictions, the Shemona Esrei, or the Amida, which along with the Shema constituted the core of the daily prayer service. At the same time, the Tanaim expanded an old prayer to include an imprecation against what were known as minim, Jews with incorrect beliefs. And in this period, this could only have meant the early Jewish Christians or the early Hebrew Christians. Those Jews who were moving away from Judaism for whatever reason. They were not satisfied with Judaism, or Judaism wasn't meeting their needs, and this new emerging religion was coming about. They were moving in that direction. They were known as minim. These were people who observed the laws of Judaism, but at the same time accepted the messiahship of Jesus. So they sort of stood with one foot in two worlds. And although the rabbis continued to regard the early Hebrew Christians as Jews, they reformulated this prayer in order to expel them from the synagogue. And that was testified to by the Gospel of John and some of the church fathers. In addition, the Tanaim enacted laws that were designed to further separate Jewish Christians from the community by prohibiting commerce with them and having certain interrelationships with them. And thereafter, it's possible to trace the process of separation or schism from the end of the 1st century CE until the period of the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, the Bar Kokhba revolt was from 132 BCE, 132 CE to 135 CE, when the Tanaim outlawed the writings of early Christians, declaring that Torah scrolls or texts with divine names that were copied by Christians had no sanctity, had no religiosity whatsoever. This was clearly a polemic that was being issued by the Tanaim against the Gospels, which must have been circulating at that time in some form or another by then. Now remember, all of this happens after Jesus dies. All of this happens in a post-Jesus world. In the time of Paul, somewhere around 60 CE, the decision to open Christianity to Gentiles had taken place, and the Tanaim gradually found themselves facing a church whose members were not Jews from the point of view of halakha, Jewish law, and to the rabbis, they were not Jews with incorrect views about the Messiah, but they were Gentiles who claimed now to be the true Israel. And it was probably for this reason, not necessarily this reason alone, but dominantly this reason, that the Tanaim began to see Christians as the other and not as Jews who had simply gone astray or who had simply followed a different path. This process was completed by the Bar Kokhba period, which was sort of a period of Jewish sovereignty that followed the revolt of Simon Bar Kokhba against the Romans in 132 CE. Jewish Christianity, or Hebrew Christianity, had been submerged, while Gentile Christianity had gained the ascendancy. And since it was now virtually the only form of Christianity that the rabbis encountered, they termed Christians Notzrim, Nazarenes, regarding them as completely separate and a completely alien religious group to what Jews or Judaism or what Judaism was. And just briefly, for a moment, a third point of view, that of the Romans, I think at least needs to be mentioned here. The Romans at first regarded Christians as part of the Jewish people. And when Christianity spread and took on a clearly different identity, as acknowledged by both Jews and Christians, the Roman government then modified their view. The Emperor Nerva, who ruled from 96 to 98 CE, freed the Christians, probably including Jewish Christians, from paying a Jewish tax decreed as punishment in the aftermath of the revolt of 66 to 73 CE, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So they were cleared from paying that tax. So it was from that point clearly that the Romans now regarded Christians as a separate group. And the way was paved for the legitimization of Christianity as its own religion. The decline of the old pagan cults, coupled with the really tremendous success of Christianity, especially after it became the official religion of the Roman Empire, would eventually lead to the acceptance of this new faith as the official religion of the Roman Empire in 324 CE of the Common Era. So let me also talk for a moment a little bit about another schism that took place in Judaism, and that is between two groups of Jews. One group was known as the Pharisees, and one group was known as the Sadducees. There was a divergence in the Hebrew Jewish religion, even in the biblical period. And in many cases, the very same issues that had led to conflicts in biblical times became the basis for disagreements and strife in later times. And yet the nature of the sectarianism of which we're speaking is somewhat different. In biblical times, if you think about it, the fundamental question was whether the God of Israel was to be worshiped exclusively, or whether an identification of him combined with Canaanite gods and cult was to take place. To the Judeans, the same point was at stake in their rejection of the Samaritans in their subsequent schism. It resurfaced earlier in the Hellenistic period, in the years leading up to the Hellenistic reform and the persecution of Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And that, remember, is the Hanukkah story. The nation rallied behind the Maccabees precisely because, like the biblical prophets and the Deuteronomic editors of the historical books of the Bible, they would not tolerate any tinkering with the exclusive monotheism, the oneness of God, to which they adhered. Now, however, the debates would all take place within a new context. Matters would revolve around two axes. First, while it was now accepted without question that the canonized Torah was authoritative, there were many differences of opinion as to its interpretation, which is something I mentioned earlier. And secondly, while extreme Hellenism had been rejected, The exact parameters of assimilation or Hellenization and of separatism and pietism, those were still to be determined. Ultimately, these questions would be resolved only after the destruction of the temple with the rise of rabbinic Judaism. For the present, they would be played out not in the ivory towers of rabbinic disputation, but in a political, social, and even economic culture of the Hasmonean period. And we're talking, when I mention Hasmonean, don't let that word frighten you that you don't know what it is. It simply means the Maccabean period, the period of the Maccabees. The Hasmonean dynasty refers to the dynasty of the Hasmonean priests, who were rulers of the temple at that time. Sources suggest that the Hasmonean priest kings relied on a body of advisors or counselors. They were called the Gerousia. This body, Gerousia, was composed of kind of a shaky coalition of Pharisees and Sadducees, two groups which were most active in the political life of the Jewish state. And like the other groups that I'm going to describe, they also had distinct religious ideologies, as well as very specific social characteristics. So first, let's talk about the Pharisees. So the Pharisees derive their name from the Hebrew Perushim. The word Perushim means separatists. This designation most probably refers to their separation from ritually impure food and from the tables of the common people, later termed as Amma Aretz, people of the land, in rabbinic sources, who were not scrupulous in regarding the laws of Levitical purity and the giving of tithes. So it was these Perushim, these Pharisees, who separated themselves from those people. The term may originally have been a negative designation used by the opponents of the Pharisees. Tannaitic sources describe those who observed the laws of purity as chaverim. Chaverim, we know today in modern times means friends, but at that time meant associates. And groups of people were known as chavurot. The chaverim are contrasted with the Amma Aretz. And although most historians assume these groups to have been Pharisaic, the sources never associate the term Pharisee and chaver with them. In rabbinic sources, the Pharisees are sometimes designated as the sages. It's kind of an anachronism resulting from the view of the rabbis that they were the continuators of the Pharisaic tradition. And although the influence of the Pharisees grew steadily until they came to dominate the religious life of the Jewish people, the Pharisees are said to have numbered only about 6,000 in the times of Herod and Herodian times. By and large, the Pharisees had three major characteristics. First, they represented primarily the middle and lower classes. Second, and perhaps as a consequence of their social status, they were not really Hellenized and seemed to have remained primarily Near Eastern in culture. They may have adopted certain Greek words. They may have adopted certain Greek intellectual approaches, but they viewed as authoritative only what they regarded as the ancient traditions of Israel. Third, they accepted what they termed the tradition of the fathers, non-biblical laws and customs said to have been passed down through the generations. And these teachings supplemented the written Torah. Remember, this was not oral Torah, as I was talking about before. This was a supplement. The traditions of the fathers or the traditions of the ancestors were a supplement to what was written in the Torah. And they were part of what the rabbis would later call oral law. They are said to have been extremely scrupulous in observing law, and they were expert in its interpretation. In a number of significant teachings, the Pharisees appeared to have espoused the views that were later incorporated in rabbinic tradition. The Pharisees accepted the notion of the immortality of the soul. I mean, that's where we think of the soul as being immortal. That came from Pharisaic tradition. Reward and punishment after death came from Pharisaic tradition, both of which the Sadducees, and we haven't spoken about the Sadducees yet, both of which the Sadducees denied. The Pharisees are said to have believed in angels, another belief which the Sadducees denied. The Pharisees accepted the idea of divine providence, believing that God allowed human beings free will, but could not play a role in human affairs. The Sadducees completely rejected the notion of divine interference in the affairs of human beings. To them, free will was complete and inviolate. And in contrast, the Essenes, another group of Jews, maintained a belief in absolute predestination, as did the sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran community. Although these views are recounted in Greek philosophical garb by Josephus, our only source for the theological disputes between the two groups, the actual points of view emerge from varying interpretations of biblical tradition, and therefore the basic outlines of the controversy need to be accepted as authentic. From the accounts available to us, it appears that the Pharisees were divided over one of the most burning issues of the period. Some advocated an accommodationalist policy toward the government, so long as it allowed them to practice Jewish traditions in the manner required by Pharisaic views. Other Pharisees maintained that no government was acceptable. Think of some of the Haredi groups or some of the Hasidic groups in Israel today, such as the most famous one being Neturei Karta, who absolutely and completely rejects the Israeli government. They feel that the only one to govern the Jewish people is God. So others maintain that no government was acceptable, whether controlled by non-Jews or by non-observant Jews, so long as it was not built on the Pharisaic notion of Torah observance. And they called upon their compatriots to rise in revolt. This dispute can be traced throughout the history of Pharisaism and continued in Rabbinic Judaism, becoming central in the two Jewish revolts against the Romans when they decided to destroy the temple in Jerusalem. Let me mention a little bit about the Sadducees. The Sadducees were also a recognized group by about 150 BCE. They, on the other hand, as I said to you, the Pharisees were more of a middle and lower class representatives. The Sadducees were predominantly an aristocratic group. Most of them, in fact, were apparently priests or those who had intermarried with high priestly families. They tended to be moderate Hellenizers whose primary loyalty was to the religion of Israel, but whose culture was greatly influenced by the environment in which they lived. The Sadducees derived their name from that of Tzadok. Zadok was the high priest of the Jerusalem temple in the time of Solomon. The Zadokite family of high priests had served at the head of the priesthood throughout the first temple times, except when foreign worship was brought into the temple, and during second temple times until the Hasmoneans took control of the high priesthood. Ezekiel had assigned the priestly duties exclusively to this Zadok clan. The Sadducees rejected the tradition of the fathers. In other words, those traditions that were passed down, which the Pharisees considered as law. And for this reason, the later rabbinic sources picture them as rejecting oral law. The notion of some church fathers that the Sadducees accepted only the Torah as authoritative, rejecting the prophets and emerging corpus of writings, is really unsubstantiated by any earlier sources. It's difficult to date the many differences which Tannaitic texts ascribe to the Pharisees and or the Sadducees. Some of these are preserved only in very late post-Talmudic sources, but those in Mishnaic materials, I think, are probably of much greater interest. But it was because of these differences, in philosophy, differences in practice, differences in how they accepted law, differences in what they saw as law, that developed a schism really between these two groups of leaders, both political and religious, and make no doubt about it, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were both political and religious leaders. They also differed with each other on theological questions. They denied the notion of reward and punishment after death, as well as immortality of the soul, as I mentioned. Sadducees didn't believe in angels. There were no divine messengers mentioned in the Bible. To them, since man had absolute free will, God didn't exercise any kind of control over the affairs of humankind. So this group ultimately splits and becomes pretty much enemies with each other, whereas in the beginning, they at least worked together to keep the cohesive nature or notion of the Jewish people together. But after these differences came to light, they really split from one another and didn't cooperate with each other, and caused a tremendous rift within Jewish society at the time of their existence. There are so many other schisms that took place in Israel. I mean, some of them were Shabbatite Tzvi and his cult of followers when he called himself the Messiah, a group of Jews that were known as the Karaites, a group of Jews known as the Frankists. There were many such splits among the Jewish people down through history. You know, it's a very romantic notion to go to synagogue and pick up the prayer book, and we talk about Kehilat Yisrael and Klal Yisrael, the community of Israel, and the continuity of the community of Israel. But we were never, as a group, all together following the same exact beliefs and origin of beliefs. The one thing that has pretty much tied all Jews together was the notion of one God. And that actually came from the first monotheist in the Bible, whose name was Abraham. There there was no Judaism at that time. He was simply a monotheist proclaiming the idea of the belief in one God. And if there's one, I guess if there's one commonality amongst all of these groups, it was the notion and the belief of one God and not in any kind of paganistic gods. And that notion of monotheism, more than anything else, has really solidified the Jewish people, whether or not you are a Reformed Jew or an ultra Orthodox Jew or a Frankist or a Shabbatite Tzvi follower or a Karaite. And all of these groups, all of these groups continue to exist today in Judaism. It's not like they've died out. They may be very small and they may not be fully practicing, but there are, just like I mentioned earlier, there are still Samaritans today in modern times. There are still all followers of all of these different people, like the followers of Shabbatai Tzvi, who claimed himself to be the Messiah in Turkey. There are still followers of Shabbatai Tzvi who live in Israel and who live in the United States today. So there's so much more to talk about in terms of schisms, in terms of splits among the Jewish people. At some point, I'll go through some other ones because I think the other ones are equally as fascinating, if not more fascinating, than some of the ones that I've mentioned. But since we only have about an hour, and I'd love to take some questions from you. If you have any questions, please unmute yourselves and ask away.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, ma'am.
So are you using the term Samaritan as synonymous with Sumerian, or are those two distinct groups?
Two distinct groups.
Okay. So the Sumerians were the people who lived in Samaria, right?
Right, yes.
Okay. Samaritans, I always thought were the Christians because they talk about the Good Samaritan.
Right. They've been associated with Christians and Christianity, but they didn't start out that way.
Yeah.
They started out as Jews. They started out as Hebrews. And because of the differences in that they picked up in some of their practices, Jews separated themselves from the Samaritans. It doesn't mean that the Good Samaritan doesn't exist, and it also doesn't mean that Samaritans today in Israel are not fully viable as Samaritans. They just don't consider themselves, nor does the Israeli government consider themselves Jews.
Thank you.
They don't have Jewish citizenship. I mean, they live in Israel in the West Bank area, and they are a fascinating group of people. It's amazing to watch them celebrate Passover, where the Samaritans actually take the blood from the lamb and put it on the doorposts of their houses. I mean, they actually follow the customs as written in the Torah, as they're specifically written, where they go back to their homes and place blood on the doorpost of their house.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I have a question. If they practice and they celebrate Passover and other holidays and other things, why are they not considered Jews?
Because they don't follow the practices as outlined in the Torah. They don't do it the Torahitic way. They do it with their own. In other words, their celebration of Passover is part halakha, part Jewish law, and part other customs that they've picked up along the way that they've included in their celebrations.
Do they consider themselves Christians?
They consider themselves Samaritans.
Oh, so they're not part of any other,
No, they are their own religion. And they actually like the independence of not being associated with any dominant or world religion. They like themselves as they are, and they don't want to be connected. I mean, if you talk to the leaders of the group, they don't want to be connected politically with any other religion, because they feel it simply diminishes or dilutes what they are as Samaritans.
So where does our modern term Good Samaritan come from?
Excuse me?
Where does our modern term Good Samaritan come from?
It comes from them and their tenets of being one of their strong tenets is to be there to help other people. Love your neighbor as you love yourself. They follow that stringently.
Rabbi, can you speak to the more modern schisms that Solomon Schechter created, conservative Judaism, or have reformed with Rabbi Geiger?
Yep.
How did that come about?
Reform, let me just speak to it briefly. Reform Judaism grew out of Orthodox Judaism in Germany via a man by the name of Abraham Geiger. There was no other formal group of Jews other than Orthodox Jews, and Abraham Geiger and his followers wanted to be Jews, but they also wanted to participate in modern society, in regular society. And much of regular society was closed off to Jews. They weren't allowed to participate. So Abraham Geiger and his ilk wanted to do both. In other words, my mother used to have an expression that said, you can you can dance at everybody's wedding. They felt that they could keep their feet in both worlds. And what they did was they consciously set up a system of what it really meant to be a Jew. In other words, they looked at what were the things that were keeping them apart. And one of the things that were keeping them apart was that they were different from everybody else. So they tried to ascertain what were the things that could make them similar to everybody else. So, for example, one of the things that made them different or set them apart was that they dressed differently. They had the long beards and they had the black clothes and they had the hats, and they just simply looked differently. And Geiger and his followers they said, is this something that's really crucial to our being Jewish? I mean, do we need the earlocks? Do we need the payas? Do we need the long beards? And they decided that they didn't really need those things. It wasn't going to take away from the way that they saw being a Jew, or they saw Judaism. So that was one aspect. So they started to dress like everybody else. And then they looked at another thing that kept them apart. And they saw that in society, one of the things that brought people together was the breaking of bread, that they were able to sit down with other people and eat together. And Jews couldn't do that because of the laws of kashrut. So they had a large discussion as to whether or not kashrut, the observance of the kosher laws, was something that maintained their sense of being a Jew. Was it something that made them Jewish, or was it something that was, I guess you might call, extra? Was it not necessary? And they decided that they could abstain from the laws of kashrut. They could begin to sit down with other people, and they would appear to be the same as everybody else, even though they were different in their practice, in their houses of worship. And one third thing they tried to ascertain made them different is they worship differently. In other words, they worshiped on a different day. Everybody else in German society worshiped on Sunday, which they consider, depending on when you start the count, that was the seventh day of the week. And they said, does it really make a difference if we worship on Saturday? Or can we do our prayers on Sunday? Would that matter? Would that really matter to God if we started counting at a different day? And they decided again that it didn't really make a difference. So Jewish worship services started taking place on Sunday. And so in other words, when they went to synagogue, they looked like everybody else going to church. They dressed in normal clothes. They weren't eating different things. They were going to church on Sunday. Their rabbis actually dressed in priestly garb. In other words, early Reform rabbis wore collars. They created services in the vernacular. In other words, they prayed in German. They didn't pray in Hebrew. And if you look at some of the early Reform prayer books, the Union Prayer Book, if any of you are familiar with that, the first prayer book here, Reform prayer book here in America, it's all in English. There's virtually no Hebrew. Coming from that classical Jewish tradition, there are still 5 major Reform synagogues today, 2021, that still have services on Sunday morning. They do not have services on Shabbat. They have services on Sunday morning, and that's their tradition, that they worship without yarmulkes, they worship without taluses, they worship, that those were things that early Reformers thought that they could give up. And that became a schism with Orthodox Jews. They couldn't live with Jews who were practicing so differently than they were practicing. And that was really the second form of Judaism to come about in the 1800s. It's not, most people think conservative Judaism came next. It was actually Reform was the first one to break off of Orthodox Judaism. Conservative came next. It didn't come about till the United States. Conservative Judaism actually is the only branch of Judaism developed here in America. It's the only really American branch of Judaism. And the major reason that conservative Judaism developed was because there were Orthodox Jews here in the United States, and there were Reform Jews here in the United States. They worshiped in different synagogues, they worshiped in different cities. And when the great migration of Jews from Russia came here in the early 1900s, there was a tremendous emigration of Jews from Russia because of the disasters and the pogroms that were going on in Russia. They fled and came to the United States. And they came to the United States. They were Orthodox Jews. They didn't know anything other than Orthodox Jews. And when they got here to America, they saw Reform Jews and they saw Reform Judaism, which was so foreign to them, completely foreign. They saw Orthodox Judaism, and they didn't want to be Orthodox Jews. And why didn't they want to be Orthodox Jews? Because they were afraid. They were afraid the same thing was going to happen in America as Orthodox Jews as happened in Russia then as Orthodox Jews. So a sort of a middle road was developed in the early 1900s, which was called conservative Judaism, which was traditional in some respects and modern in other respects. The two things that traditional Judaism, that conservative Judaism kept were Shabbat, which was one of the main planks of conservative Judaism, and the other was kashrut, observance of kashrut. And those were the two central tenets that conservative Jews were supposed to follow in terms of orthodoxy. Observance of Shabbat, a traditional observance of Shabbat, and a traditional observance of kashrut, of keeping kosher. And that's how conservative Judaism broke off from mainstream Orthodox Judaism when it got here in the early 1900s. I mean, that's a very kitsur view. I mean, that's a very shortened view of how it developed. And then Reconstructionist Judaism actually developed out of a rabbi who came from Philadelphia. He actually went to Israel, and he developed Reconstructionist Judaism in Israel, and then brought it back to the United States. And the home of Reconstructionist Judaism is now in Philadelphia. The home of Reform Judaism was in Cincinnati. And one of the reasons it was in Cincinnati, I'll tell you point blankly, was because when Reform Jews from Germany got to the New York Ellis Island, they saw Orthodox Judaism. They had no desire to be Orthodox Jews. They decided they were going to go to California, to the West Coast. They were going to be on the other side of the country to practice Reform Judaism. So they got in their caravans and they headed west. They got as far as Cincinnati, and they said, "This is far enough." Got to Cincinnati, and that's where the home of Reform Judaism developed, with the development of the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. Now, you know, today there's a branch of Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, one in New York, one in LA. They did finally get to the West Coast, and one in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So these schisms took place in different places, all for different reasons. And yet, if you think about it, maybe this is my projection, but if you think about it, to me, that's one of the great beauties of Judaism. One of the beautiful aspects of Judaism is that there are so many varied roads that lead into Judaism, and it makes such a beautifully woven tapestry of tradition, of custom, of idea, of ideology. And even though there are rejectionists in Judaism who reject some of them, you know, that's okay. That's okay. They still continue to exist, and people still continue to practice the way that they feel the most comfortable practicing within the bounds of their faith, of their religion.
One of the things that's confusing to me is I think of Judaism mainly as a way that we treat other people, or we treat each other.
Mm-hmm.
And all these, that's what ties us together. The things that, all these schisms seem to be like political parties.
They are.
Dividing over
because Judaism was not always just a religion. Judaism was a great deal of political activity. There was always politics involved in Judaism. The Judaism that you're referring to is ethical Judaism, and that's a very strong chord of Judaism and the Jewish people, that ethical practice of how we treat other people, of how we look at other people. And it's one of the mainframe ideas of Reform Judaism. We call it social action. And we call it, I mean, you may call it by the name of Tikkun Olam, or fixing the world. That's one of our main ideas. And even if we don't eat like other Jews, even if we don't pray like other Jews, even if we don't celebrate like other Jews, we take seriously as Reform Jews the notion of Tikkun Olam, the notion of helping to fix the world, to make the world a better, safer, stronger, more caring, more just, more righteous world of people. And you know, that's what we do as Reformed Jews. And even if we're not able to do it on a large scale, you know, we do it from our own personal space, from our own personal place. And even if you just help one person, I mean, it still makes a huge difference to that one person.
Have you said on occasion, I think you've said that the conservative movement would eventually disappear?
I think it will. I think it will. And I think the reason that it will is because there's no longer any reason for conservative Judaism to exist, that middle stream. And the reason I say that is because the vast majority of conservative Jews do not any longer follow those two tenets of being observant in Shabbat and being observant of Kashrut. That's one reason I think it will ultimately go by the wayside. And I think many of the tenets of conservative Judaism have been folded into Reform Judaism as Reform Judaism has become a little more traditional. It's not what classical Reform Judaism was when it came here, you know, in the late 1800s. It's vastly changed, even though there are still some very classical Reform Jews who don't wear talitim, don't wear yarmulkes, who don't pray in Hebrew, who don't, you know, there are people who hold with that. But I think as a whole, the Reform movement has moved much more to the right to sort of engulf or envelop what conservative Judaism started out to be.
So it's less rebellious?
Excuse me?
It's less rebellious than it was originally?
I think it's much less rebellious than it was. Yes.
And
Yes.
what
I mean,
is
I still think it has that tenet of rebellion when it says that things in Judaism are optional and you choose what is viable for you. In other words, you choose in Judaism what's meaningful to you, and that is what you do. That's how you practice. I think that's a great deal of rebellion against what traditional Judaism says you absolutely must do in order to be considered a Jew. So I think that rebelliousness is still viable. I think that rebelliousness is still there. I think it just takes a different form.
And what does Reconstructionism fit into all of that?
Reconstructionism basically was a reconstruction of the prayer book. The prayer book is reconstructed, and they eliminated, Reconstructionist Judaism eliminated the concept of Bachar Banu. Now, the words Bachar Banu mean who chose us from among the other nations. It banished the notion of chosenness. It doesn't affirm the idea of chosenness simply because Reconstructionist Judaism believes that chosenness separates us from all other peoples. In other words, it makes other people think that Jews are better than everybody else because God chose us. So, for example, if you I'll give you an example of how that works in modern times. If you go up for an aliyah, if you come up to the Torah for an aliyah, the first blessing at the Torah, says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu, who chose us from among the nations. So they have completely changed the aliyah, the words of the aliyah in a Reconstructionist synagogue because they reject the notion of chosenness. So that's a huge difference between Reconstructionist Judaism and all other branches of Judaism who don't reject the notion of chose us. Okay, and you know, we explain the notion of chosenness more as God chose us because we were willing to be what God wanted us to be. That's why God chose us. There's a midrash that says that God went to 70 different nations, and each one presented its case as to why it couldn't be God's chosen nation. And he went to Israel last, and Israel said, sure, we can affirm that, and that's not a problem for us. So God chose the Jewish people to be what's called an Or LaGoyim, to be a light to the nations. In other words, to champion the notion of one God and what God stands for. So that's sort of a shortened version as to what the difference of Reconstruction is. The prayer book is vastly, if you've ever gone to a Reconstructionist synagogue, many people get lost in the service because the service doesn't sound, you know, if you go to an Orthodox service and you go to a Reform service, basically the prayers are going to be the same. I mean, they may do them all in Hebrew and we may do them in English, but the basic prayers are still the same. The 18 benedictions are still the same. They're not in a Reconstructionist synagogue. They've reconstructed anything in the prayer book that smacks of the concept of chosenness.
Rabbi, when you were talking about the Haredi in a previous sermon,
Mhm.
I couldn't help but wonder how much can you be like that and still be in the same religion as I'm in? I'm watching you throw rocks at women at the wall. How is
They-
they really Jewish?
I mean, well, I ask the same question. I do. I mean, you've heard me speak about it. I ask the exact same question. This is the Jewish thing to do. This is how you treat another human being. You throw garbage at them. You know, if you want to disagree, fine, disagree. Okay, I can understand that. We can disagree all day and all night. We can disagree, but you don't hurt somebody. You don't call them names. You don't physically knock them down. You don't, I mean, that's not, to me, that's not the Jewish thing to do. I do not understand how the Haredim think about things. You know, they're so, it seems to me that they are so, they're so caught up in their own values or sense of value, in their own belief system, that people have stopped meaning anything to them. You know, that individuals, that feelings don't mean anything. And I'm sorry, I reject that. I have virtually nothing to do with the Haredim. I because of the way that they act. They don't, for me, they don't personify Jewish custom, Jewish tradition, or Jewish ideology. You know, just because they only eat kosher food, I'm sorry, that isn't what makes you a Jew. That to me, that's
Yeah.
to me. You know, there's a lot more that makes you a Jew than the fact that you eat kosher food or that you observe Shabbat. And I think that was one of the problems. This is my own editorialization now. I think that was one of the problems with conservative Judaism when it was set up. It was set up to fail because, not purposely, but I think it would fail only because over time things change, people change, their ways of practice change. And to say that you have to do these two things and only these two things, I think that was doomed to fail over time. And I think that was one of the downsides of the setup of conservative Judaism, politically, from a political from a political standpoint.
Thank you.
Rabbi, could you talk just briefly about the schisms between American Jews and Israeli Jews?
Yeah, sure. You know, if it depends on, you can't, I don't think that you can lump all Israeli Jews into one group. I think there are different groups of Israeli Jews. I think there are young Israeli Jews today, and I think there are older Israeli Jews who have actually fought for Israel. You know, those Jews who have really, you know, put themselves on the line for the state of Israel. I think those are two very different groups of Israeli Jews. And I think that there's sort of a dichotomy between what America sees as being Jewish, what the American Jewish community sees as being Jewish about Israel, and the Israeli Jewish community thinks about themselves as being Jewish in Israel. And I think one of the differences between the American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community is that the American Jewish community is much more involved in the rights of other people. I think we're more I think the American Jewish community is a little more sensitive to the differences of how people are treated. And I think that's one difference between American Jews and Israeli Jews. I think Israeli Jews also, many of them, not all of them, but I think many of them stand for the idea that you know, we're here, we're Jewish, our Jewishness is synonymous with our democracy in Israel. And I think that's a problem. I think that's a problem for Israeli Jews, because America sees Israel, or American Jews often see Israel, rightly so, as trying to be a democracy and a theocracy at the same time. And I don't think that the two are able to coexist. I think that you can have democratic principles, but I don't think you can live as a theocracy with democratic principles.
Rabbi, I think that it comes down somewhat to tolerance, and I see this on both sides of the political aisle, that it doesn't seem like they tolerate each other, and I do not like this idea of cancel culture. I want to hear all points of view, whether the Nazis are in Chicago, like the Civil Liberties Union fought that, or conservatives at one point of view. The liberals and the Republican conservatives have to tolerate each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that is not going on in this country today, even within our Jewish community.
That's true. I don't think we listen to each other enough, or respect each other enough. But that's just the American Jewish community. The question was about the you know, the difference between American Jewish community and the Israeli Jewish community. I mean, I think the Israeli Jewish community has a particular view of Palestinians and Arabs due to their relationship over the years. And I think that American Jews, for the most part, have had no skin in the game. You know, they've contributed and they've given money, but they haven't put their lives on the line like Israeli. And there's a difference in the way that they see their political / religious life. Remember, most most Jews in Israel, the vast majority of Jews in Israel are not religious. They tolerate the religiosity of Israel, but they're not religious. There are a lot more, I mean, per capita, there are a lot more Jews in the United States that are connected to, say, synagogues than in Israel. There's only really, I mean, 10%, if that, of the population of Israel are Orthodox Jews. But look at the power that they hold within the establishment of Israel over everything that goes on in Israel. I mean, and that's not true in the American Jewish community. The American Jewish community has their own individual groups. I mean, Orthodox, the Union of Orthodox, the Union of Orthodox congregations, they control what goes on in Orthodox Judaism. The URJ, the Union of Reform Judaism, controls what goes on in Reform Judaism, and the United Synagogue of America controls what goes on in conservative synagogues. And generally, there's an adherence to those umbrella groups. You don't have that in Israel. Okay, you do not have those kinds of groups in Israel, and you also don't have the same communication. There's a much greater degree of communication among American Jews, even though we may not agree with each other. I think there's a greater degree of communication in the Jewish community than there is in Israel. I hope that answers your question.
Oh, it did. Thank you, Rabbi.
Okay. Any other questions?